Good afternoon. We will now move on to the next item of business. So could I ask those members who are leaving the chamber to please do so quickly and quietly. And the next item of business is a debate on motion 15876 in the name of Jenny Gilruth on Education Scotland Bill at stage 1. I would advise members for their information that there is no time in hand this afternoon. I call on Jenny Gilruth, Cabinet Secretary, to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 10 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I move the amendment in my motion in my name. I'm pleased to present the Education Scotland Bill and set out its general principles to Parliament this afternoon. And I want to start by thanking the Education, Children and Young People Committee for their considered work on the bill and an insightful Stage 1 report. May I also pay tribute to the outgoing Education Convener Sue Webber for her convenership of, in my opinion, the most important committee in the Parliament. Sue Webber's devotion to improving the lives of Scotland's children and young people was unwavering. And though we may differ on party politics, I welcomed her approach to collaborative politics for the greater good. Presiding Officer, I welcome the committee's support for the general principles of the bill at stage 1. And indeed, there is clearly much that we all agree on across the chamber, including the need for education reform. The status quo is not working. In a parliament of minorities, the duty falls on all of us to ensure that we work together to deliver for the people we represent. Presiding Officer, I know each of us cares deeply about improving Scottish education. Each of us also understands the urgency behind education reform. The pandemic has fundamentally changed Scotland's schools. Standing still post-pandemic is not an option. Scotland's children, her teachers, lecturers, parents and carers expect this Parliament to work together to bring about reform. Happy to do so.
Willie Rennie.
I think we will support the bill at stage 1 today. But I hope she understands that there are deep concerns and that will require fundamental amendments to the bill. Will she be open to making those changes?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Rennie for his intervention. He will know from our meeting yesterday I'm very open to engaging with the opposition on a range of different amendments, but fundamentally the point I'm making in my opening statement today is that the need for reform and the impetus for that is very real. And we have a limited time between now and the 2026 election. I'm very keen to make progress on this bill and to deliver on those expectations. Notwithstanding the challenge that the member puts today, I'm happy to engage with him or any other member in this chamber on that point. I do want to thank all the stakeholders who have contributed to their views on the bill thus far. And when I reflect on the impetus for reform that they have reflected, I look back on my own experiences in the classroom, but also from my time as a member of the Education Committee in the previous Parliament around about some of the challenge we experienced historically with the qualifications body. And I've listened very carefully to the Parliament's views about the SQA, and I know that rebuilding trust with Scotland's teachers will be absolutely critical. And that is why reform, as I've previously set out to Parliament, is not in itself a panacea. Cultural change, both in government and also in our agencies, will be essential if we are to build a new qualification system which carries with it the credence that children, parents and the teaching profession will expect. Yes, I will.
Stephen Kerr.
I agree with Jenny Gilruth about the need for a change of culture. Does that mean she can give an assurance to the Chamber that when these new bodies are formed, that the same people will not simply occupy the same chairs or different chairs in the same boardroom?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, look, I think the member raises an important point. This, of course, was addressed at the committee when I gave evidence back in October. We are fundamentally talking about people's employment rights, and I think the member should be mindful of that. But I recognise the challenge here in that regard, and I commit to working with the member on this and on a range of different other options in relation to reform. In my statement on the National Improvement Framework last week, Presiding Officer, I set out the long-term vision for education in Scotland, a key response to an ask from the committee. The bill is a really important step towards that vision, and I look forward to returning in the new year, subject to parliamentary business, to fully debate our actions to drive improvement. The bill is not the final step in our education reform agenda. Rather, it is the first step that provides the necessary structure our system needs to ensure teachers, families and pupils have confidence in our schools and in the assessments provided. And as the committee has discussed... Yes, I will do so.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
The Cabinet Secretary for taking an intervention on that point. And on structure specifically, does the Cabinet Secretary believe that with accreditation remaining in the SQA, that the structure is sufficient and robust to ensure trust in the qualifications body going forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I thank the member for her intervention. We discussed this at the committee in October. I think the member raises a really important point around accreditation. There have been some challenges in recent times in that regard, and I commit to Parliament today to looking at that suggestion in more detail. I'm more than happy to work with the member on that. Other members have raised issues around about accreditation too. It's also worthwhile putting on the record that we did look at a range of different options for where accreditation could sit. I know the committee recommendation was that it was moved to the SEQF. That's not without challenge, but I'm more than happy to work with the member on that, recognising the need for a new qualifications body to provide more independence, I think, and more credence to how we can look to accredit qualifications more broadly. It's really important we build back trust with the teaching profession, but also with Scotland's parents and carers. Presiding Officer, as the committee has discussed, the bill can rightly be seen as the scaffolding that supports a range of different education reform, all of which builds on evidence, including findings from the OECD and Professor Muir. And of course, there are a number of non-legislative reforms which are already moving forward, including, for example, the curriculum improvement cycle. And furthermore, I also want to see more opportunities for Scotland's teachers to develop their own practice, drawing on best research. That is why we are establishing the Centre for Teaching Excellence, working closely with teachers and national education organisations. And I'm delighted to say that through a competitive process, we have now identified the University of Glasgow as the host institution. I'm very grateful to other institutions who came forward with an interest, showing the world-class strength of our academic institutions across Scotland. And it's very fitting that the new centre will be based in Glasgow, which was announced as UNESCO's new learning city earlier this month. We will now work with the university to take forward the establishment of the centre so that we can, at pace, offer those important opportunities to Scotland's teachers. Presiding Officer, the way the new qualifications body works with schools needs to feel different for teachers. So to support this, I've committed to seconding a secondary head teacher into Qualifications Scotland. This head teacher will lead a dedicated schools unit within the organisation. Working closely with teachers and pupils in secondary schools, they will help support qualifications delivery. The post will be advertised in the new year, and I would strongly encourage interested secondary head teachers from across Scotland to apply. The establishment of Qualifications Scotland and the Office of His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education is fundamentally about improving pupil and learner outcomes and supporting our teachers. For too long, our national education bodies have been distant from those that they serve. Too often, they are perceived as being an impediment to delivering excellent teaching, or worse, in lacking credibility with the profession. So for credibility to be restored, pupils and teachers must be at the heart of decision-making. That is exactly what this bill intends to do. For Qualifications Scotland, the new requirement for the board to include practising teachers and a person with knowledge of the interests of those undertaking qualifications will provide greater diversity and challenge. The creation of the learner and teacher charters developed with those who use our education system will further provide greater transparency and accountability by providing the opportunity for greater involvement in decisions that affect and impact education. The bill enshrines the independence of inspection and moves the balance of power from ministers to the Inspectorate. And while significant, this will not be unfamiliar territory for many of Scotland's teachers. However, the move will increase public confidence in the independence of inspection and, perhaps most importantly, ensure that the strengths and challenges identified really drive improvement. Presiding Officer, the ways in which our schools are inspected also require to be updated post-pandemic, and with the last iteration of How Good is Our School being published back in 2015, the need for change is clear. Work to refresh the framework for school inspections has already begun, with significant engagement including with teachers, local authorities, parents and carers, as well as children and young people themselves at the heart of that process. The bill builds on that and will establish an advisory council, bringing in wider perspectives while maintaining the crucial independence of inspection. And I have listened to views from stakeholders and members of the committee that the bill should be further strengthened. Further, I have responded to the recommendations raised by the Education Committee in their Stage 1 report. I agree that the bill provisions need to deliver the necessary separation between the awarding and accreditation functions of Qualifications Scotland, delivering transparency, integrity and fairness. That specific governance and accountability provision set out in the bill includes the new requirement for ministers to appoint a convener for the Accreditation Committee, although, as I intimated to Ms Duncan Glancy, I am open to looking again at how we can further strengthen that provision. The convener, of course, will have a new and a direct advisory relationship with ministers, along with new commitments for separate accountability and reporting. And I know that some members and stakeholders think we need to go further. That's also why I've commissioned the chair of the SQA to advise how to deliver greater administrative separation between the two functions within Qualifications Scotland. I'm happy to do so.
Briefly, Mr Mason.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Would she agree that a lot of the issue around independence and separation is the attitude of people as much as the legal lines?
Cabinet Secretary, please bring your remarks to a close.
I'm more than happy to speak to the member on that, and perhaps he can give me more detail on that out with the debate. However, I recognise the challenge in relation to accreditation. I've already committed to working with the Chair, having commissioned further advice on this, and I've said to Parliament today I'm happy to work with members on that option through the legislation. I'm conscious of time, Presiding Officer. The Education Scotland Bill is a really important step forward in creating an education system that allows teachers to deliver excellent teaching and pupils to fulfil their full potential. We may disagree on some aspects, but across the Chamber, I know there is a willingness to support the general principles of the bill and to listen to and consider each other's views and ideas. And in that spirit, I hope the Parliament today will agree to the general principles of the Education Scotland Bill. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I would invite all those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons. And I now call on Douglas Ross to speak on behalf of the Education, Children and Young People Committee. Up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be speaking today on behalf of the Education, Children and Young People Committee about our scrutiny of the Education Scotland Bill. Can I begin by saying, as a relatively new convener, I came to this bill late on at stage 1, and I'm extremely grateful to the work done by my predecessor as convener, Sue Webber, and her stewardship of the committee as they looked in detail at this bill. I have gone back and watched some of the evidence sessions and read the material that was submitted to the committee, so I'd like to thank all of the individuals and organisations who provided evidence, either in person or by responding to our calls for views. At this point, I'd also like to thank our clerking team and my colleagues on the committee for their diligent work in the bill so far, including former members of the committee who were involved in the evidence gathering. Part 1 of this bill seeks to create a new qualifications body with strengthened separation between its awarding and accrediting functions and increased influence for educators and learners. It was clear from the evidence that we received that the SQA as a body has lost the trust of learners, their families and teachers. There has been a lack of transparency in the way they've conducted their business, and it has poorly communicated with many of those who are taking and teaching its qualifications. The committee recognises that this new body will have much to do to win back that trust. In our report, I will give way to Mr Whitfield.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the convener taking an intervention on this point. Was he as disappointed as I was at the Scottish Government's response to the committee's report, particularly in relation to the SQA? But does he here, having heard what the Cabinet Secretary said today, have any confidence that he feels the Scottish Government are in a position to move far enough to meet the recommendations that the committee have made with regard to the SQA?
Douglas Ross.
I was warned within an inch of my life to be very careful that this speech I'm delivering as the convener of this committee, and perhaps I may intervene later on and give more personal opinions on that if Mr Whitfield would allow. But I do take on board the point he makes, if I can say that. In our report, we make it clear that the measures to strengthen the separation of the awarding and the accrediting functions are not strong enough, and they need to be enhanced. Now, whether that's to the extent that they sit in separate bodies or remain within the same body but with appropriate structures and sufficient resourcing to ensure that the two functions are independent of one another. In her response to the committee's report, the Cabinet Secretary highlighted the advice that she'd commissioned from the chair of the SQA. This was to review the organisational design and leadership structures to further enhance the distinction between the two functions, and she confirms that advice has been received. So it would be helpful if the Cabinet Secretary could give an indication of what that advice is and the options that she's considering as a result, either now or when she winds up this debate later on. We know that the Scottish Government is currently chairing a short life working group which is considering the scope of accreditation, and in her response to the committee, the Cabinet Secretary has set out details of the group's work, which is welcome. In correspondence last week, the Cabinet Secretary said that through education reform and this bill, there is an opportunity to improve the oversight of qualifications. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary whether she anticipates that there will be amendments to the bill as a result of this group's work? As I've already mentioned, the SQA have often been criticised over many years for the way it communicates with learners and educators. The committee understands that the bill seeks to enhance and formalise the role of both groups and what role they will have within the governance of the new body Qualifications Scotland. The committee agrees that this is important to those taking and those delivering the qualifications and assessments, and that they should be represented and included in the governance arrangements. In our report, we sought more detail around the measures currently proposed for the governance of Qualifications Scotland, such as on the membership of the Strategic Advisory Council, ensuring that registered teachers are appointed to the board are current classroom teachers, and ensuring that learners and teachers and practitioners make up the majority of their respective interest panels. The committee notes the Cabinet Secretary's response on these points, including her commitment to bring forward amendments at stage 2 to ensure that learners and educators are the majority group on each interest committee. The committee heard that a key component of the new qualifications body rebuilding trust in the sector would be to ensure that both learners and educators were consulted widely and inclusively, with clear feedback loops in place to report back on any action taken. However, we heard that with some measures, such as the Learners' Interest Committee, the bill will largely formalise current engagement practices, some of which are the practices that were criticised in the past. And others, such as the Strategic Advisory Council, the proposals in the bill substantially replicate the legislation which was established to create the SQA's Advisory Council. As such, it wasn't clear to the committee how these measures will lead to an improvement in the governance of the new qualifications body. In her response to our report, the Cabinet Secretary states that the Learners' Interest Committee is a key, immovable and explicit component within the organisation's governance structure, which is not the case with the current Scottish Learners Panel. But I'm not sure that that's a reassurance that the committee is looking for, that things will be significantly different for the new body. The committee also heard from many about the importance of not only creating mechanisms to hear from learners, but ensuring that such forums were age-appropriate and supportive of meaningful participation. The Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland Young Advisory Group suggested that a young advisory group, similar to the model used by the CYPCS, be set up to influence the qualifications body, noting, and I quote their words, "Most children and young people would feel better in a space only for children and young people." I note from the Cabinet Secretary's response that the Scottish Government will, ahead of stage 2, consider this issue further and explore options to best ensure that meaningful participation of children and young people does indeed take place. Presiding Officer, Part 2 of the bill establishes the Office of His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education in Scotland. A key aim of the bill is to strengthen the independence of the Inspectorate. But those giving evidence repeatedly stress the importance of the Inspectorate being independent, but also being seen to be independent. And the committee heard mixed views as to whether the current proposals provide sufficient independence. Professor Graham Donaldson, who was head of HMIE from 2002 to 2010, when the Inspectorate was last a single body before it became part of Education Scotland, stated that he had more operational independence then than the Chief Inspector of Education would under the terms of this bill. And he called for amendments to enshrine the independence of the role of Chief Inspector. The committee also heard calls for the bill to explicitly set out the purpose of the inspections the Inspectorate would carry out. The committee believes that this would be helpful, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary setting out the purpose of the inspections clearly in her response to today's debate. It would also be helpful to hear the types of inspections the Inspectorate will realistically be carrying out. The committee appreciates that the bill provides the Inspectorate with an opportunity to broaden its inspection programme beyond current school inspections. However, in practice, without increased resources, it's unlikely to be able to do so. Now, the Scottish Government could manage expectations of the new Inspectorate by confirming either it will be resourced to do more, or accept that it will be largely resourced to the same level as it is now, and therefore not expected to do much more. In our report, we recognise the volume of people who responded to our calls for views who expressed their frustration that the bill focuses purely on structural change and doesn't progress wider educational reforms such as those proposed by the Hayward Review. When she came to the committee, the Cabinet Secretary said that she couldn't deliver on the aspirations of the Hayward Review without the reform of the qualifications body. It would therefore be helpful if the Cabinet Secretary could give more detail on how she intends to deliver on those aspirations, providing the bill is passed, and when she envisages such changes being made. Presiding Officer, in our report, the committee agreed with the general principles of the bill. However, we believe that this bill will require substantial amendment to ensure that the improvements envisaged by the Scottish Government in relation to engagement, governance, organisational culture and accountability become a reality for learners, teachers and staff. I look forward to hearing more about potential amendments during the debate from the Cabinet Secretary, from members of the committee and indeed members across this Parliament, because it is clearly in all of our interests to ensure that this bill gets it right and leads to new bodies that hold the confidence of learners, parents and carers and teaching professionals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Ross. I now call on Miles Briggs to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I also start by thanking the Education Committee clerks for the power of work that they've put into the Education Scotland Bill to date, and all those involved in our evidence sessions. And as already has been stated, we've seen significant changes to the membership of the Education Committee during the inquiry period, and like the Cabinet Secretary, and as it is the season of goodwill, I'd like to pay tribute to all members involved of the process, especially my Scottish Conservative colleagues Liam Kerr and former committee convener Sue Webber, for the positive contribution they've brought to the committee over this session of Parliament. I'd like to also thank the organisations from the wider educational sector for their contribution to the debate to date and helpful briefings as well. As has been mentioned, the Education Scotland Bill will replace the SQA with a new body, Qualifications Scotland, and transfer inspection duties to a new office, His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education in Scotland. And it is important, though, that we remember why we are here today and with this bill in its current form, because in 2020 the introduction of reformed examination system was criticised after a series of administrative and computer errors led to several thousand incorrect higher and intermediate certificates being sent out to candidates. In 2021 the Scottish Government announced it would be scrapping the SQA after the body was condemned for the exams results fiasco during the COVID-19 pandemic. Fast forward to today, and there is cross-party agreement that we need to see change and reform to re-establish confidence in the qualifications and inspection structures and organisations in Scotland. And I believe the committee report is a helpful guide for ministers to significantly now strengthen the bill. And I look forward to the discussions the Cabinet Secretary and I will have in the new year around amendments at stage 2, which Scottish Conservatives want to see. As Douglas Ross, the new neutral education convener of our committee, stated, the committee's report seeks guarantees around oversight of Qualifications Scotland, in particular where teachers, students and families will be able to share their views in an appropriate way to develop public faith in the body, and how the newly independent inspectorate will actually be able to challenge Scottish ministers and education authorities in the future as well. Perhaps most limited in detail at present is how the inspectorate will be responsible for scrutinising national bodies, including Qualifications Scotland and Education Scotland in its future role. And in reading the conclusions of the committee report, I know the former teacher in the Cabinet Secretary will always be insistent, and quite rightly so, that members have done their homework in reading the conclusions, but I don't think the Cabinet Secretary can have escaped the conclusions we did draw in the committee. And the report does reflect widespread frustration about the slow pace of educational reform we have seen in Scotland. I hope that's something the Cabinet Secretary has indeed taken on board. As such areas, it's still not clear where genuine reform is going to take place and where the vision the government has for Education Scotland. Now, I believe the bill in its current form is a missed opportunity to reform that organisation. Although not part of the bill's provision, the Scottish Government has stated that Education Scotland will no longer be replaced, but refocused to lead curriculum design, delivery and improvement, but we haven't seen detail on what that looks like. Now, in the time I have today, I wanted to touch on a number of areas Scottish Conservatives do want to see significant progress at stage 2. Good leadership and accountability are absolutely key, and ministers must get this right if we are to build the trust of teachers, parents and carers, and most importantly, pupils and candidates sitting exams. Like with other successful boards, diversity of representation on the Qualifications Scotland Board is critical and needs to be right to provide for the voices, skills and experiences needed to guide that organisation. I believe the committee recommendations taken forward will help to achieve this. I also note, though, a number of other concerns with the bill, specifically in relation to the status of BSL, for example, within the bill, and indeed within the Languages Bill currently making its way through Parliament. I welcome the Scottish Government's response to the committee's report and hope ministers support the committee's recommendations that BSL should have parity of esteem with Gaelic throughout the bill. Only this approach, I believe, will guarantee the rights of deaf children and young people will be upheld, and I hope we'll see these amendments brought forward at stage 2. I also note the concerns, though, raised by the Children and Young People's Commission ahead of today's debate in relation to child protection and the potential inspection gap around child protection and safeguarding in schools. And I hope there will be clarification, perhaps, when the Minister's closing around this issue as well. Deputy Presiding Officer, I do believe this bill presents an opportunity for the emerging organisations to also be more accountable to Parliament. In recent weeks, I believe it's become apparent that we need to see a greater scrutiny role and indeed hope that ministers will agree significantly to strengthening this within the bill. Finally, though, and perhaps the area we on these benches, as I've mentioned, really want to see taken forward is potential reform of Education Scotland. This bill is a missed opportunity to reduce bureaucracy in the classroom. For example, in relation to all teachers being asked for evidence when requesting extra time for candidates, or ideas which teachers have been talking about for a long time now about reducing workload by providing support for teachers around the Curriculum for Excellence resources in the classroom, which have not been taken forward by Education Scotland. The future of Education Scotland is important, and I hope ministers will urgently outline their vision and also the details to Parliament so we can all contribute to what that can look like. In conclusion, the Scottish Government must ensure the strong accountability of new bodies and a more coherent vision for education reform in Scotland. It's clear that ministers plan a very tight timetable for the establishment of these new bodies and functions, and although that is understandable, it will present challenges and potential failures as well. Scottish Conservatives will this evening support the general principles of the bill at decision time, but we do so with qualification that we need to see significant changes to the bill at stage 2 and stage 3. The SQA's reputation has been damaged in recent years. The recent controversy over higher history marking, just the latest concern to undermine confidence in that organisation. However, ministers must also take their responsibility, having dithered over delivering reforms in recent years. What ministers are currently proposing in the bill feels little more than a cosmetic name change. So Parliament, therefore, has an opportunity, I believe, to strengthen and build a much stronger bill. If the Scottish Government are serious about restoring Scotland's once world-leading educational reputation, then they must change their current approach and produce meaningful plans to deliver change which our education system so desperately needs. If ministers are bold and imaginative in delivering a more accountable and transparent vision, and one which we can help build these organisations, qualifications organisation and inspection systems that delivers for pupils, teachers, parents and carers, then they will have our support. And I look forward to the debate at stage 2 and 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Briggs. I now call Pam Duncan-Glancy to open on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to open today on behalf of Scottish Labour. And I'd like to thank my committee colleagues and to all the organisations, individuals, pupils, parents and teachers and staff in schools across the country who gave evidence to committee on this bill. I think it's fair to say that the education reform has been keenly anticipated for some time. But sadly, I think the bill falls short of expectations, recommendations and hopes that so many people have had for change. Scottish Labour agree with teachers, parents, pupils, trade unions, the Children's Commissioner and countless experts on reviews that the SQA needs to be abolished. The Inspectorate needs to be independent and the curriculum in the senior phase needs to align with what young people want and need from the education system. The bill before us today was an opportunity to do this, to bring about necessary reform and, crucially, to restore trust in the qualifications and other education bodies in Scotland. But without amendment, I worry this could be an opportunity missed. Because, Presiding Officer, reform is essential. I will.
Cabinet Secretary.
The member for giving way. I hope she's heard from me at committee and today a willingness to engage on amendments. Is it the position of the Scottish Labour Party to vote to support the general principles of the bill tonight, as the member voted to when serving in committee?
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
The member will know that I will come on to explain the party's position this evening and to allude to the recommendations that the committee have made. Presiding Officer, reform is essential. Last week, statistics showed that 40% of pupils in Scotland have additional support needs, but at the same time, the number of ASN teachers has fallen. 1 in 3 children are absent from school, and far from recruiting more teachers, teacher numbers are falling. On top of this, exam results have declined this year, and the attainment gap is the widest on record for hires and advanced hires. Everything is going in the wrong direction. Opportunities are being denied, and that this bill doesn't address the scale and reality of decline is of huge regret. And it's not just me saying this. The EIS has said that it's difficult to see how the bill will provide the necessary separation of functions to deliver the independence and, importantly, the perception of independence required to build professional and public trust in the new body. The Children and Young People's Commissioner said the bill will barely move us forward in addressing deeper issues impacting the provision of education. In a parent survey by Connect, a parent said the bill feels little more than a rebrand of the SQA. And in the face of all of this critique, I'm afraid the government response to the committee report is disappointing. And I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's indication that she will work across the chamber, but she will need to move on from the response to the committee if this is to be meaningful engagement. Fundamentally, though, I'm concerned that the bill the government has brought fails to deliver on the bill's stated purpose. The government says that the purpose of this bill is to create an organisational infrastructure for education in Scotland that more effectively supports the system. In not splitting the accreditation function from the qualifications body, it doesn't achieve this aim, despite the fact overwhelming evidence to the committee suggested that responsibility for accreditation should not sit with the new body. The Cabinet Secretary says the government has undertaken a full exploration of alternative locations for the function, but it has not yet explained why the different bodies considered wouldn't be suitable alternatives. And I have to say, the fact the government appear to have come to this conclusion on the strength of advice commissioned from the chair of the SQA beggars belief. Presiding Officer, the splitting of the accreditation function will be vital if Scottish Labour are to support the bill at stage 3. The government also say that the bill's intention is to support the right balance of responsibility and autonomy between different parts of the system. But it doesn't do this either. The balance is all wrong. The proposed learner and teacher committees have crucial voices left out. The charters lack teeth, and there's no clear link between the Strategic Advisory Committee and the interest committees. The absence of representation for teaching trade unions on the board of the new qualifications body will risk trust falling before the body is even set up and is unacceptable. I will take an intervention on that.
Sue Webber.
I thank Pam Duncan-Glancy for taking my intervention. If you will recall that some of the evidence that we did hear at committee was that at some point we have to say no to some of the many interest groups. It can't be limitless, and at some point there will have to be a point at where we can't include everybody.
Always through the chair, Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the member for that intervention, and the member makes a very good point, but the fact of the matter is there is no guarantee of any particular representation on this committee as the bill stands, and that is the thing that I think the government will have to address and provide more clarity on, particularly the absence of trade unions and teaching trade unions on the boards of the SQA. The bill as drafted also means that the Independent Inspectorate will be accountable to government ministers rather than Parliament, leading experts to suggest, as we've heard, that it leaves the Chief Inspector with fewer powers now than presently. With no link between Education Scotland and Qualifications Scotland and no mention of Wither's recommendations, the bill doesn't deliver the coherence in education the government claims it does either. And crucially, one of the starkest reasons reform is needed was what happened in 2020 on the current First Minister's watch, when the poorest pupils were downgraded. On this, worryingly, the bill is lacking too. We agree with NASUWT that the lack of equality data hindered the SQA's ability to fully examine the 2020 approach, and we believe that any new body must have a more robust attitude towards data collection. The Scottish Government's response that existing duties are a catch-all is insufficient. Presiding Officer, the Government haven't got the principle, substance, structures or the balance of power right in this bill, which is why we cannot give it our full support in its current form at this stage. And the committee were clear that the bill required significant amendment. Our ambitions for reform must be greater than this. We want to, on these benches, deliver on the recommendations for reform called for by Professor Ken Muir, Louise Hayward and James Withers, and yes, to abolish the SQA, make the inspectorate independent and align curriculum with assessment. Reform of this scale would fulfil what the Government claims this bill's purpose and principles are about. But as I've set out, the bill before us doesn't do this. It's also difficult to determine whether it achieves the Government's long-term vision for education, because we've yet to get the second part of that conversation, which we're told comes next year. So we're being asked to decide on something we don't yet have full information on. What we do know, though, Presiding Officer, is that any vision will fall flat if the Government does not move on the key recommendations for improvement that people have set out: splitting the accreditation function, rebalancing power, giving trade unions a place on the board, mandating robust data collection, ensuring parental representation, guaranteeing the Strategic Advisory Council reflects the interests of protected characteristics, and aligning Qualifications Scotland and Education Scotland. So, Presiding Officer, to close and to be clear, on reform, the Government must do better than this. The bill must change significantly if it is to get our support. And if the Government changes direction, and I look forward to engaging with the Cabinet Secretary to help that happen, listens to the voices who have said it needs to change, we'll support it. But if not, we will be behind the countless people outside of this place calling for a change of direction. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Duncan-Clancy. I now call on Ross Crew to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This bill is certainly a long time coming, and I want to thank everyone who's not just been involved in the Stage 1 process, but in the years of work that brought us here. And education reform has been a consistent debate for the 25 years of devolution and going back long before that. But I think this current cycle probably started around 2017, and in that year, the then Education and Skills Committee of this Parliament published a report on the performance of our national education agencies, the SQA, Education Scotland, Skills Development Scotland and the Scottish Funding Council. I sat on the committee at that time, as did the Cabinet Secretary, Liz Smith, and apologies if I've missed anyone else in the room who was there at that point. And that report made it very clear to Parliament that Education Scotland, and particularly the SQA, had already lost the trust and confidence of the teaching profession. They were seen as out of touch, hostile to feedback. They often not only couldn't communicate with teachers, young people and parents, they couldn't even communicate with each other. Probably the clearest example of that is the fact that within the Curriculum for Excellence we have a course requirement of 140 hours for National 5 courses and the ability to take up to 9 of those courses. But you can't timetable 9 times 140 hours, and that's because Education Scotland were in charge of the number of hours that were required and the SQA was in charge of the number of Nat 5s you could take. And despite being based in the same building, they couldn't communicate with each other to reconcile that. One of the most consistent areas of evidence that we took was on the slopey shoulders within education governance in Scotland, exemplified by the then Curriculum for Excellence Management Board, who, when asked who was ultimately responsible for any given area, would often simply point the finger at anyone else in the room rather than take responsibility themselves. I want to read out what I think is a really damning conclusion from that committee report on the SQA in particular and put it onto the record. It said, even if the SQA's position were hypothetically to be accepted, the committee would still find it difficult to understand how the SQA had fulfilled its role to core customers, the learners of Scotland, having produced qualifications that have led to an onerous workload, a breakdown in trust and threats of industrial action by teachers. That was in 2017. That same conclusion could be come to now. There was a clear theme in that report and in the OECD's review a few years later around that lack of accountability for areas of responsibility. And I do think Education Scotland in a lot of ways got off easy because the evidence we collected on the SQA was so outrageous that naturally the focus was there. Significant challenges were unearthed at the Education Scotland as well. But the culture at the SQA, particularly senior management, was an area of key concern. And the committee's top conclusion then was, and I'll read that out in full again, the evidence the committee has received from teachers should give the SQA serious cause for concern. The committee considers the distinction in feedback between the committee's survey and the SQA Commission survey is perhaps indicative of the current relationship with teachers. There would appear to be a divergence between what teachers will express to the SQA and what they will express to this committee. The SQA is invited to review its approach to engaging with teachers to enable candid communication from those with criticisms to make. The SQA also needs to be able to demonstrate how these views impact on their processes in order to improve trust. End quote. again, that conclusion has been come to again now years later. An overhaul of communication and a reset of relationship with teachers simply didn't happen. And then fast forward to 2020, we have the biggest scandal at the SQA since 2000. All the more scandalous for the fact that they and the government had been warned for months, particularly by Ian Gray and myself, of the system that they were designing and the inequalities that were baked into it. And I'm not ashamed of the transactional politics that happened in the aftermath of that, where in exchange for our votes on a vote of confidence, the Greens got those grades restored and secured multiple reviews, including what became Professor Hayward's independent review of qualifications and assessment. And that allows me to make the point that this bill is only one part of a much wider reform picture. Organisational reform needs to go alongside qualification and assessment reform. So I welcome the Government's commitment to more continuous assessment, but I am disappointed that Professor Hayward's recommendations have largely been rejected or kicked into the long grass. And I think we'll be back here in 5 or 10 years' time to belatedly accept them, because the Government still has no answer to what I think was the key question coming out of the 2020 scandal. Yes, grades went up across the board, but they went up more for young people from more deprived communities, posing the question, do exams make our attainment gap worse than it otherwise needs to be? And I think the answer to that is yes, but I don't think the Government has an answer to it either way. The 2021 alternative certification model did prove that continuous assessment can work. The problems there were largely with workload, because the decision to cancel exams was taken far too late. But that whole experience during the pandemic highlighted the really key issues of poor communication from the SQA to teachers, to students and to parents. And I think the bill could be stronger on communication in particular. Part 1, Section 8 requires the Strategic Advisory Council to be consulted, but just the SAC. So I'll be bringing forward amendments at stage 2 to require wider consultation from Qualification Scotland with teachers, with young people, with parents. The communications challenges, though, go beyond the bill. So I want to close my opening contribution just by going back to the evidence we took recently on higher history this past year, and the issue that arose there, that the SQA cannot at present directly communicate with students or even with teachers. So they had no ability to directly tell every history teacher in Scotland or every history student what was actually going on. So I would ask the Government, do they recognise that that is an operational problem that can be resolved with the creation of the new body? Of course, good communications requires not just good platforms, but also good practice. And that is a cultural change far more significant that will also be required, that I'll come to in my closing remarks. As you can imagine, Presiding Officer, I've been working on this issue for some time. I have far more to say than there is time for, but I'll conclude now and I'll come on to those cultural challenges and the Inspectorate in closing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Creer. And now Colin Willie-Rennie to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Our education system, there is no doubt, is in a crisis, and it's been the top subject of political debate for many, many years. But the Inspectorate played no role in blowing the whistle on any of that. Where was the indication from the Inspectorate that the Scottish educational performance was slipping down the international rankings? Where was that? Where was the highlighting by the Inspectorate of our serious, deep-seated problems with behaviour in the classroom? And where was the highlighting by the Inspectorate of our deep problems with absence as well, particularly following the pandemic? They were absent themselves from all of these big issues. And then you come to the SQA, who lost dramatic confidence through the pandemic with what Ross Greer has just described through the marking episode and the arrangements they put in place. And both of those organisations are absolutely essential if we are to provide robust challenge and provide confidence and trust within the organisation of education in Scotland. If we don't have national bodies that are respected with authority, how can they hold local authorities to account for how they perform? And equally, how do they challenge the government itself? If they are weak, education is weak, and that's why we need this dramatic change, and that's why we'll support the bill today. The SQA reforms do need changed as well, the new qualifications body. I think the higher history episode of recent months shows exactly why we need a separation of the accreditation. The fact that the Chief Executive, the Chief Examiner, did her own investigation into the performance of our own organisation in that marking episode shows exactly why the system isn't working. And even if it was the best review in the world, nobody would believe it because it wasn't independent. It needs to be independent from it. Yes, briefly.
John Mason.
Would the member accept it was reviewed externally?
Willie Rennie.
The process was reviewed externally, but the involvement of the Welsh representative in the details of the review was not substantial. And that, I hope the member accepts that. And even so, it needs to be separate in order to make sure we build the confidence. Again, a brief intervention.
Liz Smith.
Also accept that there is a slight concern in the comments made by Professor Graham Donaldson, who was a very fine HMIE head of inspection, who's making the point that in this bill there wouldn't actually be the same flexibility that he had several years ago.
Willie Rennie.
Yes, our remarks speak for themselves. I mean, we do need to have a separation of the accreditation. It's not going to be easy, though, because there isn't just an accreditation unit within the SQA. It's integrated with the whole of the organisation. So we'll need to change the guts of this organisation to make sure that we can have a separate accreditation function. So I understand the challenge that the Minister is facing in trying to deliver what Ken Muir had in his recommendations. But in order to instil confidence in the new qualifications body, we need to make it happen, and I'll be bringing forward amendments on those terms. The inspection function was identified as needing to be separate from Education Scotland almost from the very beginning. This was highlighted by experts within the sector, that there is no point in having the inspector as part of an agency of government trying to hold the government and others to account when they are responsible to the ministers themselves. So this was a day that was a long time coming, and it needed to change in order, again, to instil confidence. The perception is incredibly important. And therefore, the independence issue I would like to explore further with the Minister when we go through the later stages of the bill. Because I don't really understand, I've not been convinced that the Minister can explain why she needs to retain the powers to direct the inspector. Now, I understand there are particularly valid reasons in particular circumstances why she's used those powers, and nobody would disagree with the application of them. But why does she need to have them? Because, again, independence is incredibly important to ensure that we have confidence. I've taken an awful lot of intervention. I've only got 6 minutes altogether. Safeguarding is important we get this right. This is for those members of staff, not just teachers, below those who have been convicted or those who have lost their fitness to teach authentication. And we need to have a system that checks the local authorities and how they're dealing with members of staff who perhaps aren't performing particularly well, but they just sometimes don't address the problems, the deep-seated problems that could come into bigger problems at a later stage. So we need to have the Inspectorate provide some monitoring of local authorities on their employment of individuals to deal with those gaps. The GTCS have been absolutely right in highlighting this as a problem. We need to broaden the scope of the Inspectorate to include the inspection of councils and the initial teacher education institutions. They need to be inspected as well. And how we inspect needs to change. But if I can just say with my closing remarks, is the issue of voice. I think we need to be careful about who we put on all these various committees, because we could end up with a Communist Politburo if we're not careful. But we need to make sure also that we listen to the boy at the back of the class who will never speak to anybody. They're never going to be on a committee. They're never going to be standing up there with the qualifications body and making their voice heard. But their voices are incredibly important. I want to hear from them, even if it's only for 20 seconds. I want to hear what they've got to say. And the system with the Children's Commissioner have highlighted how that can be done. I think that's one of the most important reforms that we can make.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. We will now move to the open debate. I call Jackie Dunbar to be followed by Sue Webber. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be able to take part in the debate today, particularly in my relatively new role as Deputy Convener of the Education, Children and Young People Committee. Whilst I have not been a member of the committee since the start of the evidence-taken part of the bill, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all those who have taken the time to contribute and have given evidence to the committee over the past months. And I would also like to thank the committee clerks for bringing it all together and the support that they've shown me since I've came into post. I'd also like to thank committee members who have worked together to agree the general principles of the bill and reach in what I thought was a unanimous agreement of the Stage 1 report. So it was disappointing to hear from Pam Duncan-Glancy today because we as a committee went through 400 and odd paragraphs line by line and we agreed them. But then she says that the Labour Party... I'll take intervention on that point.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. And the member will know that I raised significant concerns during the discussion on the report and indeed through the passage of it in committee. And that I made it very, very clear that the government would have to make changes at this bill to get our support. That is consistent with my approach today.
Yes, and I don't deny that. What I'm saying is that as the report, we all agreed it unanimously, the Stage 1 report line by line. But it sounds like today that Labour don't want... Can I just finish this part and then I'll take you, Ms Webber. It sounds today that the Labour Party want to get rid of the SQA, but if they abstain today, then the logic kind of suggests that they disagree in having a new qualifications body. And I'm a little bit confused about that. I'll take an intervention from Ms Webber.
Deborah, thank you for taking the intervention. You rightly point out that the Stage 1 report was very critical of the bill and does recommend a suite of changes and amendments that are coming. So, like you, I'm a bit concerned or where this newfound division has come from.
Always through the chair, Jackie de Boer.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. So, and of course, it would be remiss of me if I didn't pay tribute to Sue Webber and also to Evelyn Tweed, because they were the former convener and deputy convener of the committee, who and they started the work and built the foundations of where we are today, with where we are with the Stage 1 report. So my personal thanks to you both. The Education Scotland Bill is part of the Scottish Government's programme for government. Their vision is to improve the lives of young folk and children and the First Minister's ultimate goal of eradicating child poverty in Scotland. Education is so very important to the lives and opportunities that lay ahead for our children and young people. And what bairns learn at a young age can allow them to unlock their full potential and open the door to all sorts of opportunities. In short, if we give our bairns the best possible start, it can benefit them throughout their lives. This is a principle that is underpinned by so many of the Scottish Government's policies to date. Starting at birth, when a child is born, every family in Scotland receives a baby box and many are supported by Best Start grants. Throughout their childhood, support is available through the game-changing Scottish Child Payment, and free education has been extended from nursery right through to university. And soon, if the budget passes, the Scottish Government will be righting a wrong by making every child in Scotland equal. Those children who happen to have 2 or more siblings will no longer be disadvantaged by the UK Government's 2-child cap, righting the wrong of the current Labour UK Government, who have continued with the horrendous 2-child cap. Turning to the substantive content of the bill, Presiding Officer, there are a lot of positive steps proposed, such as setting out the functions of Qualifications Scotland, a new organisation with the authority to craft qualifications, whether for itself or others to award, and to devise programmes of learning to match those qualifications. People need to have confidence in our national qualifications and in the body that awards them. That confidence has to come from all corners. Confidence from our children and young people who are most affected, from their parents and carers who will undoubtedly want the best for them, confidence from the teachers who we trust with our young people's education and care throughout the school day, and confidence from the employers who will be looking at these qualifications when offering jobs in years to come. That confidence simply is not there with the SQA as things currently stand, and I hope that moving forward we can work to ensure that Qualifications Scotland can build the level of trust everyone expects of our national qualifications organisations. With dedicated committees for students and teachers to hold Qualifications Scotland accountable, with the creation of charters to set out what learners and teachers should expect from Qualifications Scotland, and with an enhanced governance model that separates its awarding and accreditation functions, ensuring decisions on these are taken independently of one another. I believe Qualifications Scotland will ensure it operates with integrity, transparency and fairness. This bill will also create His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education in Scotland, who will lead and oversee a new inspectorate to drive forward the high standards we quite rightly expect in our schools. There is a clear need for the Chief Inspector to operate independently, including independently of ministers, where it will set out the inspection methodologies and inspection judgment. Scrutiny is proposed to come through regular reports.
Mr Barr, you will need to conclude because you're over your time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Barr. I now call, and I would reiterate to members there is no time in hand. I call Sue Webber to be followed by Evelyn Tweed. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as the previous convener of the Education, Children and Young People Committee, I'm delighted to be able to speak in this debate today, and I want to thank everyone for their kind words. It was a role that I loved, but I know that I've passed it on to very safe hands with my colleague Douglas Ross. For years now, the Scottish Government has been promising to reform Scottish education, and we've heard about the timeline from Ross Greer, who's been around in this place a little bit longer than me, despite his age. What we found, though, is that the main catalyst for some of this change has been the utterly disastrous handling of exams during the pandemic. But the concerns have been bubbling away for a long time, with Scotland's declining performance, which predates COVID, so we can't really use that as an excuse. The SNP under the SNP, education in Scotland has gone backwards in international rankings, and Scotland's mean PISA scores in maths and science is at a record low. And the SNP have also failed and are failing to close the attainment gap, with the gap between the poorest and the richest primary pupils, reading, writing, literacy and numeracy levels all remaining similar to those pre-pandemic levels. What this Education Scotland Bill aims to do is replace the SQA with a new body, Qualifications Scotland, and that Qualifications Scotland will take on functions relating to developing and awarding qualifications, accrediting other qualifications and providing advice to ministers on these matters. And the bill also establishes His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education as a new independent body for education inspections, with the inspectorate being responsible for school and early learning inspections, as well as evaluating broader educational services. And the Stage 1 report from the Education Committee makes it clear that there must be a major change in the education system. Yet the Stage 1 report also makes it clear that the SNP's current plans as they stand to replace the SQA deliver no real change at all. The committee report states that the reputation of the SQA has become tarnished and that legislation alone cannot change culture. Much of the culture change is down to leadership, after all, a change to ways of working and a commitment to do things very differently. So I want to focus on two areas today: the change from the SQA to the new body Qualifications Scotland and the independence of the new inspector. And we have heard much of these two things already today. The first issue I have touched upon already is the culture change that's needed. This is what must happen, and it's driven by leadership and leaders that are willing to accept that they have made mistakes. Leaders must listen to concerns and make the necessary changes from the top down. I'm concerned that's not happening right now. The EIS, the nation's largest teaching union, also criticised the bill. The organisation highlighted concerns about the lack of separation between accreditation, regulating and awarding functions of the new qualifications body. And the Association of Directors of Education Scotland has said there's a danger that change will be minimal and that the existing elements of the system are being repackaged and reinstated in a different order. This does not meet what is required for our recommended, or what was recommended by Ken Muir, Louise Hayward and the OECD. A change of name and structure is not sufficient response to Muir and OECD recommendations. There is a disproportionate focus on structures when cultural and behavioural change in national organisations is also required. ADES also said that the bill looked autocratic and top-down and questioned why the same personnel would be running the new organisations. And School Leaders Scotland said that although the bill deals with the replacement of the SQA with Qualifications Scotland, there needs to be a complete change of culture in the new body. It cannot be a rebranding with the same attitudes and a lack of transparency and of trust. The Muir Review recommended that the accreditation function be separated from the awarding function under new arrangements. Professor Muir said it was inappropriate to have the functions together, and it has appeared to some that the SQA was marking its own homework. And we have heard much of that concern today. So if the Education Bill is changing the SQA into Qualifications Scotland, but with all the same people in the same place, despite their endless failures, how can this be anything but a rebrand? And when the Cabinet Secretary did respond to Ms Duncan Clancy's intervention early on today, it was encouraging to hear that that complete separation may well be on the cards. The second point I want to look at is the independence of the new inspector. The report states that a key aim of the bill is to strengthen the independence of the inspectorate. Yet ministers will retain the ability to direct the Chief Inspector to secure the inspection of specific or types of educational establishments and have power to specify the intervals at which inspections can take place. With the evidence I heard during my term as convener of the committee, I believe it's vitally important for the Inspector to report to Parliament and not to the Scottish Government and ministers. The need for the new HM Chief Inspector to be, and seen to be, independent was repeatedly stressed by stakeholders, including Dr Judith McClure, CBE. She stated it's vital for the future development of Scottish education that should be regular assessment by qualified inspectors of the performance, achievements and problems in individual schools and other organisations providing education. These assessments will only be of use if the Inspectorate is independent and led by a gifted and experienced HM Chief Inspector of Education. You do need to conclude. I am, Presiding Officer, who is independent in his work and understands what team leadership and planning mean. I hope the SNP reflect on the committee's critical conclusions, come back with meaningful plans that will deliver the changes that Scottish education desperately needs.
Thank you. We do not have any time in hand, and therefore I will be cutting off speakers at 6 minutes, if not slightly before. Evelyn Tweed to be followed by Alec Rowley. Up to 6 minutes, Ms Tweed.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to all the stakeholders who gave their time and energy to this bill. In Scotland, we have great schools and great teachers. It's clear from the evidence we heard that change is required, and it's a timely opportunity to build on the strengths of our education system. Ultimately, this bill must serve stakeholders across the education sector, especially learners, parents, carers and teachers. The committee believes it's vital that there is diverse representation across all engagement, governance and inspection mechanisms set out in the bill. Reference made in the bill for the need to have regard to the needs and interests of those in Gaelic medium education or Gaelic learner education is welcome. We heard evidence from a joint submission from a number of organisations seeking similar provision for British Sign Language. They point out that BSL and Gaelic have similar legal and demographic status. Both languages allow the children and young people who use them to access rich culture, heritage and identity. Having access to information and exam materials in their preferred languages is a right that must be promoted and protected for deaf learners. The committee agreed and made a recommendation that BSL should have parity with Gaelic in this bill. I am pleased that the Government has acknowledged the importance of this. They have highlighted in their response to us current provisions for both new bodies. These require them to have regard for the importance of communicating in the way that best meets the needs of children and young people, including those with additional support needs. They are also considering how the new bodies can better take account of that use or wish to use BSL. I look forward to the conclusions on how best to achieve this and whether the existing measures in the bill should be strengthened to this effect. It's vital that national agencies meet the needs of everyone. We heard in evidence that without good data, it's difficult to understand whether decisions or policies have disproportionate impacts on particular groups. The committee has requested that the government set out how it plans to improve data collection ahead of stage 2. I'm glad that the government has agreed with us that this data is important. They have set out in their response to us their view that user-focused structures within the governance of Qualifications Scotland and as part of the Chief Inspector's Advisory Council will be important to gathering and considering evidence. I look forward to hearing more detail on how this process will work and how intersectional data will inform these bodies. The need for a culture change was brought up again and again in evidence, and I think it's clear that the government understands that this is necessary. Indeed, the policy memorandum stated that the bill is an opportunity to reset the culture and engagement arrangements. The bill hopes to ensure that the national qualifications bodies' governance structures reflect, represent and are accountable to stakeholders and service users. This is a positive aim. However, we heard throughout evidence fears that this bill may amount to little more than a rebrand without concerted effort to foment a culture change. In our report, the committee acknowledged that legislation alone cannot change culture. Much of change culture, as we've heard already today, is down to leadership, a change to ways of working and a commitment to doing things differently. The government has acknowledged this and set out that embedding learner and teacher voices in the process will help drive change, and this is very welcome. This bill is a single component of wider reform and is the scaffolding on which non-legislative reforms are being built. As these emerge in more detail, I hope stakeholders will feel confident in them. I know that the government is committed to ensuring this bill is accompanied by real culture change, and I'm interested to hear more detail as the bill progresses regarding how culture change will be encouraged. What does success look like? How will progress be measured? And are there other examples of similar efforts to shift culture in national agencies that we can learn from? Presiding Officer, I welcome the general principles of the bill. I'm disappointed that Labour no longer supports them. It's vital that representation and culture change are at the fore as these new bodies are built. I'm looking forward to seeing how Stage 2 will further strengthen the measures set out.
Thank you, Ms Kidd. I now call Alec Rowley to be followed by Bill Kidd. Up to 6 minutes. Mr Rowley.
Officer, I would firstly want to thank the Education, Children and Young People Committee for the work they have done so far on this bill and the comprehensive report we are debating today at Stage 1 of the Education Scotland Bill. As I read this report, I got a sense of frustration felt by many that there is a desperate need for change, but that this bill, as currently framed, will not deliver the change required. Indeed, amongst the bill's critics are the Children and Young Persons Commissioner, Professor Donaldson, Colleges Scotland, School Leaders Scotland, ADES, COSLA, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and trade unions including the EIS, NAS, UWT and Unite. However, despite the criticism, it is the view of most stakeholders, including the teaching unions, that the bill needs to pass to ensure the abolition of the SQA, and that it should be amended at later stages to ensure it has real consequences. So Labour will not vote against the bill at Stage 1, but we are clear there will have to be a lot of change for this bill to gain support as it progresses. I believe it's worth putting on the record the view of the EIS that the Scottish Qualifications Authority is a body whose reputation is irreparably damaged, having become distant from and unresponsive to the professional viewpoints of teachers and lecturers. Many will be asking, does this bill address such concerns that I know from speaking with hundreds of teachers over these last few years is a widely shared view? We know the OECD has acknowledged such concern, and they said consideration should be given to a separate body that might be responsible for the regulation and quality of qualifications, which is currently part of the remit of the SQA. And yet, in their evidence, the SQA confirmed that the bill creates a new organisation that has the same functions, not just in broad terms, but in quite specific terms as the existing organisation. I note that the committee recommendations, they say, the committee shares the concerns that at present there is insufficient separation of and distinction between the awarding and accreditation functions. And they go on to state that the committee believes the accreditation functions should sit separately from Qualifications Scotland, and that the committee asks the Scottish Government to explore more fully the options of where else the accreditation function could sit, including within the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework Partnership. I really do hope that the Government will be listening and will work with parties across this chamber to address the glaring weaknesses in the bill as it currently stands. A point the committee make in its conclusion where it states, although the committee supports the replacement of the SQA and the creation of an independent inspectorate, it does not yet have sufficient information on the wider educational reform. Whilst the committee agrees the general principles, it believes the bill will require substantial amendments to ensure that the improvements envisaged by the Scottish Government in relation to engagement, governance, organisational culture and accountability become a reality for learners, teachers and staff. As such, the Cabinet Secretary must take cognizance of the points raised in this report on these issues and respond to these with amendments and working with other parties in this chamber as we move forward to stage 2. I also pick up, Presiding Officer, that there is a lot of disappointment from many involved in education and skills that this bill is fairly limited and that there is a greater requirement for much wider educational reform in Scotland. The committee report acknowledges this when it states that respondents to the committee's calls for views repeatedly expressed disappointment that the bill focuses on structures rather than policy change, and that the bill does not offer a more comprehensive package of reform. Some, including COSLA, YouthLink Scotland, the Scottish Youth Parliament and the SQA, argued that the reforms in the bill must be part of a bigger package, with the SQA stating, and I quote, "The bill should be a more catalyst for more far-reaching and fundamental reform. Changes should not start and stop with the provisions in the bill, and if it were to do so, a major opportunity would be lost." A point picked up by the committee when they say the committee acknowledges the frustration of those who wanted the bill to include measures for wider reform, particularly in relation to assessment and qualifications. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I look forward to the Government's response to the report, and I sincerely hope the Government will work with all parties across this chamber as this bill progresses.
Thank you, Mr Rowley. I now call Bill Kidd to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Up to 6 minutes. Mr Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by thanking everyone in the Education, Children and Young People Committee, especially our excellent clerking team, as well as the many organisations and individuals who have contributed to this legislation so far. And I'd like to say to them that I and my colleagues look forward to working with them further at stage 2. I believe that the Government is serious in its desire to improve outcomes for our learners and in supporting those delivering further positive outcomes in classrooms and education settings across Scotland. I am grateful for the broad support that the general principles of the bill received at stage 1. We also need to keep in mind that this bill only represents a part, albeit a significant one, of the desire we all share for educational reform. It is intended to build on the findings of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development and the comprehensive review led by Professor Ken Muir. I believe the bill will provide the necessary structure to support broader reforms across our education system, and I look forward to hearing the Government's plans in this regard. Centrally, the bill is about creating an education system that delivers and serves our children and young people better, and those delivering that education also. The establishment of Qualifications Scotland and the enhanced independence of His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education reflect a welcome shift towards improving outcomes and rebuilding trust. For too long, national education bodies have been seen as too distant, too remote from the front line. This bill is here to bridge that gap. The governance processes embedded within Qualifications Scotland aim to ensure that the expertise and experience of both pupils and teachers are at the heart of decision-making, by requiring practising teachers from schools and colleges, as well as individuals with knowledge of a learner's interests, to serve on its board. Additionally, the creation of learner and teacher charters developed collaboratively with their users will bring a welcome clarity to the expectations placed on Qualifications Scotland. Similarly, the statutory establishment of the Learner Interest Committee and the Teacher and Practitioner Interest will further these aims, achieving, I hope, not only a structural change, but a cultural one too. I appreciate that some would like to see further steps taken to ensure this cultural change is firmly embedded in the legislation, notably the submission from the Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland, who I thank for their briefing ahead of today's debate, in which they highlight views over the importance of ensuring children participate in decision-making. Also, I want to say that I fundamentally agree with them that children need to be at the heart of the changes if we are to be successful in the broader aim of, as I've said, not only looking at structural change, but affecting a culture change. And I'm happy to explore ways of achieving this with them. Of course, we must also recognise that legislation alone cannot achieve the level of practice and cultural transformation required. I note that the Scottish Government is progressing a range of complementary reforms, such as the establishment of the new Centre for Teaching Excellence and the ongoing refocusing of Education Scotland to lead on curriculum design, delivery and improvement. These initiatives, alongside the provisions of this bill, aim to ensure that our national education bodies are not only high-performing, but also accessible and trusted by the teachers, the children and the young people they serve. And I look forward to both watching and scrutinising the development of these proposals. We must also take a moment to recognise that Scotland's education system has much to be proud of. Our schools and teachers deliver extraordinary achievements every day, and we should be very careful about being in any way perceived to undermine these successes. However, we must also be open about the challenges we face. I believe this bill is a critical step in strengthening our education system to meet these challenges head-on, ensuring that every child and young person has the opportunity to fulfil their potential. The changes outlined in the bill and the broader reform programme are not about discarding the strengths of the existing system, but about building on them. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I urge all members to support the principles of the Education Scotland Bill at Stage 1, because we need to all work together to shape an education system that is not only fit for today, but ready to meet the needs of tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kidd. And I call Stephen Kerr to be followed by Faisal Chowdhury. Up to 6 minutes. Mr Kerr.
Well, nothing personal against the ministers on the front bench, who individually I quite like, but I'm afraid I cannot bring myself to trust the SNP with Scotland's education, let alone reforming Scotland's education, because for as long as vested interests have an automatic veto over change in Scottish education, as they do now, we will be stuck with the same problems. The SNP government can't and won't take on the establishment conventional wisdom. They can't and won't stand up for the best interests of teachers or parents or young people. They're afraid to upset the liberal consensus in our education system. They won't go near the presumption of mainstreaming for children with additional support needs who are often horribly failed. They won't go near dealing with the breakdown of discipline in our schools, which has seen a horrific rise in the number of violent incidents occurring in schools, 45,000 last year alone. And last week, we saw the Cabinet Secretary backing off on teacher numbers and permanent contracts, claiming that a deal was in place with COSLA only for it to unravel within hours. The SNP's education reform agenda is a dishonest chimera. Let's start with Qualifications Scotland. In the words of the SQA itself, the bill, quote, creates a new organisation that has the same functions, not just in broad terms, but in quite specific terms as the existing organisation, unquote. It's a name change, nothing more. At the core of the SNP's own Muir review was the sensible proposal that there should be a separation between the SQA's accreditation and awarding functions. Professor Muir, who I've always found to be eminently reasonable, argued on the basis of experience and evidence that without the separation of functions, the SQA was in effect, quote, marking its own homework, unquote. But the Cabinet Secretary and the bright sparks in her team have decided to set aside these findings. Yet another example, I'm afraid, of a clapped-out government with no appetite to reform the education system because they are enthralled to too many vested interests.
Martin Whitfield, briefly.
Very glad for the member to take an intervention. Would you agree with me that I struggle to see the evidence that actually they understand why the separation is so important?
Stephen Kerr.
I would agree with that, because on the basis of all the evidence presented, the evidence suggests a clear case. But we have a government that is enthralled to vested interests. The cluttered landscape, as the OECD described it in its 2021 report, of all these different groups competing for attention, competing for their space. And we have seen the Cabinet Secretary, like her predecessors, not daring to take on these interest groups. Remember John Swinney's flagship education reform bill? It fell at exactly the same hurdle. And so I support the conclusions of the Education, Children and Young People Committee report on stage 1, that the accreditation functions should sit separately from Qualifications Scotland. If, as the committee notes, this bill is intended to attract the confidence expected or hoped for in a national qualifications body, then the bill is clearly failing in this objective. Elsewhere in its report, the committee states that culture change is not a product of legislation. It's been quoted already. I completely agree. Culture change is a product of leadership, and I am pessimistic about culture change inside a renamed, failing SQA run by the same people who have been unable to deliver culture change previously. Now I want to say something about the proposal to establish an independent office of His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education in Scotland. The Scottish Conservatives have long argued for this, and we have not been alone in repeatedly pointing out how inadequate the regime of inspection is. The Inspectorate should report to this Parliament, as Audit Scotland does. The critical appointment which will determine the success or otherwise of this significant change, which I welcome, will be that of the Chief Inspector. And I return to the point that I made a few moments ago about the importance of setting the right organisational culture, and that will be down to the leadership of the Chief Inspector. The fact that the bill is opaque when it comes to describing the purpose of inspections is itself very unhelpful, a point made by the committee in its report. The level of resource to be made available to the new inspectorate and the scope of its functional operations is also unclear, and that is not satisfactory, even at stage 1. And finally, I turn to Education Scotland. As the NASUWT made clear to the committee, Education Scotland has lost the trust and confidence of teachers. The bill does not change this. The bill doesn't come anywhere near it. So I quote Professor Mark Priestley of Stirling University. He told the committee, quote, "Currently, we have lots of issues with agencies that have overlapping functions and a lack of clarity about functioning. There are demarcation issues and boundary issues. There are agencies that do operational and strategic stuff that also evaluate their own work. So there are conflicts of interest. The system is set up to justify itself and to celebrate its success, rather than take a critical look at what happens, and that is seen very clearly by practitioners working on the ground. I'd say that Professor Priestley hits the bullseye. So I back the committee's request that the Scottish Government set out its full intentions on education. Scotland, the Cabinet Secretary may recall, in previous private conversations with her, I have made it very clear that if we cannot find the purpose for Education Scotland and the value it adds, then we ought to do away with it. This bill is clearly inadequate, Presiding Officer.
Thank you.
And that's
I now call Faisal Chowdhury to be followed by John Mason. Up to 6 minutes, Mr Chowdhury.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It has been clear for years that SQA is not fit for purpose. After repeated mistakes, trust between teaching practitioners and the SQA is at an all-time low. Whether it be the higher history exam controversy or the injustice of the 2020 exam results, members recognise changes is needed. The Scottish Government had the opportunity with this bill to turn the page and build a new body, which works in partnership to deliver for learners and teachers. Unfortunately, it does not achieve that and falls short of what is necessary. In this evidence to the Education Committee, Professor Kenneth Muir said, "We need a system that builds greater trust and increases empowerment." The issue of rebuilding trust is the fundamental part of why this bill is necessary. I will discuss today whether it falls short in rebuilding trust and increasing accountability, specifically regarding Qualifications Scotland. I would first like to note, as other members have, the proposed accreditation power for Qualifications Scotland. In this report on replacing the SQA, Professor Muir said he was encouraged by the ministers to be bold and leave no options off the table. But the Scottish Government, after previously accepting the recommendation on splitting responsibilities, is no longer interested in being bold. And now, proposed Qualifications Scotland retains awarding and accrediting powers. Recently, the issue with the higher history paper were compounded by the perception of the SQA making its own work. The perception, regardless of any new name, will remain for Qualifications Scotland if it continues to be both an awarding and accrediting body, and will not improve confidence. The Education Committee was told of the perception of the decision being made for teaching professionals rather than by them. If Qualifications Scotland is to avoid the issue faced by the SQA, it must be truly representative of and engage with educators. While the teachers will be included on the board, the extent of this representation, other than numbers, is not clear. And the lack of trade union membership is not acceptable. This lack of clarity regarding representation is seen in other areas. In the interest committees, there is nothing to account for the wide range of experiences in learning and teaching. The large presence of Qualifications Scotland's staff on Interest Committee contradicts their purpose entirely. Their function, other than advising Qualifications Scotland, is also not clear. If these committees are to be a meaningful mechanism as the policy memorandum status, they cannot just be a talking shop. In the provision regarding the Strategic Advisory Council, there is again no specification on its membership, and how the Council will interact with the Interest Committee, which, following recent controversies, should be key. We must see further detail on how all these bodies will ensure representation and responsibility. Otherwise, the issue which plugged the SQA will repeat themselves. I want to finish by discussing equalities. Of the parts of the Qualification Scotland I have mentioned today, all must endeavour to include the voices of ethnic minorities and anyone who experiences prejudice in education. Scotland is committed to building an anti-racist education system. Those principles should be backed and the foundation of Qualifications Scotland. I understand the committee has asked the Scottish Government to set out how it will improve data collection processes for protected groups. I join in requesting that. Any new body must have the best ability to understand how its decisions are affecting learners, especially vulnerable people. To conclude, Presiding Officer, the replacement of SQA needs to be accountable, representative, and engage with teachers, learners, and parents. This reform will affect the prospect of future generations. We cannot afford to repeat the mistakes made with the SQA. This bill must deliver. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call John Mason to be followed by Ben McPherson. Up to 6 minutes, Mr Mason.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I joined the Education Committee just before the start of the Stage 1 inquiry, so I have been through all of that, but I was not so closely involved when the problems with the SQA were surfacing previously. Therefore, as a relative newcomer, it strikes me that there was a rush to commit to new legislation and restructuring, whereas on reflection, the main problem seemed to have been more about culture and how things were done, rather than with the structures themselves. Therefore, I have to say I'm relaxed that the bill does not go further with reforms than it does. Issues like independence and separation may or may not be resolved by having people in separate legal entities. And I would say that there can be a lack of independence even when there are separate legal entities, whereas on the other hand there can be effective independence even when people are in the same organisation. The Finance Committee looked at some of this with the question of commissioners and whether or not they were truly independent. So for me, the important thing is to get the right people with the right attitudes in the new and continuing roles that are envisaged. Briefly.
Stephen Kerr, briefly.
The problem with the thesis that John Mason is suggesting is an organisation is built around the leadership of one person. What happens when that person goes? How do you create a sustainable organisational culture if it's all going to be about the one person in charge?
John Mason.
Well, it shouldn't be about one person, and in any organisation you should have independent people who are challenging the leadership, as I have tried to show in my past life. Specifically, the question of independence was considered in relation to the new Chief Inspector of Education. Quite why it has to do anything with His Majesty, I'm not entirely sure. There was a general welcome for the new structure, although the suggestion of more accountability to Parliament did come up. Again, this was a topic the Finance Committee looked at previously and found that several commissioners, who were theoretically accountable to Parliament, seldom appeared before committees, because the relevant committee had too much on its plate already. So I think Parliament and committees need to be careful about what they wish for. Can I also say that I think there are many positives in our schools and in the school education system more generally. Clearly, it suits some politicians to emphasise how awful things are, but from my visits to schools and interaction with young people, I think we're producing much more rounded individuals than we did when I was at school. Curriculum for Excellence talks about the 4 capacities which we want our children and young people to have, and so become successful learners, confident individuals, responsible citizens and effective contributors. While this bill may focus on the first of these, successful learners, and rightly so, I hope we will not lose sight of the other 3, confident individuals, responsible citizens and effective contributors, which may be harder to measure but I believe are incredibly important. Surely we want to improve things across the board, and that is good. However, despite being an accountant myself, I know that some very valuable things are difficult, if not impossible, to measure. To move on to some more specific issues which the committee picked up on, I do understand why the word learner has been used as an all-encompassing term. And I also accept, as the government points out, that not every subgroup can be named on the face of the bill. However, specifically mentioning children and young people is surely important. They are such a major subgroup. The government response says that they will consider how to give better visibility to children and young people, and my suggestion, for what it is worth, would be to expand the phrase perhaps to something like children, young people and other learners. It's certainly a theme of the committee's report that children, young people, other learners, families, teachers and lecturers must all be involved throughout the education system, and I fully endorse that. But I think we also need to ensure that boards, advisory councils, etc., while being representative, do not become too large and unwieldy. Yes, a wide range of voices need to be heard, but not every single voice needs to be sitting at every single table. Some of the trades unions, like the EIS, were very keen to have a greater representation, if not an actual majority, on the board of Qualifications Scotland and elsewhere. So firstly, I do not think that any group should have a majority. There are many interest groups who should be involved in this. However, I do take the point that one or more teachers' representatives should be answerable to and accountable to teachers as a whole. Therefore, I think it would be helpful if the government could take account of this, even if they do not want specifically a union representative as such. I also very much agree with the points that carers, parents need to be involved in Qualifications Scotland. Very often, the interests of teachers, young people and parents will be very similar, if not identical. But I think there will be times when these three groups have slightly different interests from each other, for example, as happened at the time of school closures during COVID. Scotland is a small country and we should be able to do things in a simpler way with fewer public bodies. As the committee says in paragraph 416, the education landscape in Scotland is complex and we do not want duplication or confusion. I note the government's response and the emphasis on partnership working, although that always worries me a bit that it just means even more meetings. I do very much hope that Ivan McKee's work in public sector reform will reduce the number of bodies in education and elsewhere. The committee is expecting a range of amendments at stage 2, both from the government and from MSPs more widely. However, right now I agree with the committee's final conclusion that we agree to the general principles of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mason. We now move to the final speaker in the open debate, Ben Macpherson, again, up to 6 minutes. Mr Macpherson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to take part in today's debate. George Adam, who is a member of the committee, an SNP member of the committee, as Parliament was made aware yesterday, unfortunately is unwell this week, and we wish him a speedy recovery. And him not being able to take part in this debate gave others in the group an opportunity to speak. And as somebody who sat on the Education Committee, Education, Children and Young People Committee, to give it its full title, for a year, I wanted to add a few thoughts into today's debate. First of all, I want to talk about the time that we are taking with regard to educational reform, and this bill being a part of the progress that will be made over the coming years. Just like the committee that I'm now on, the Criminal Justice Committee, I think the legislation that colleagues are examining and the Minister is taking forward, the Cabinet Secretary is taking forward, some of the most important legislation that we will consider collectively before the election. And it's absolutely right that we take the necessary time to undertake this appropriately, thoroughly and correctly. I think back to August 2010 when I had been working in education in a school office at that time, and there was a lot of discussion, this is anecdotally, but also more widely in the teaching profession at that time, that opposition parties in here, unions and people in the teaching profession had some concerns about Curriculum for Excellence being brought in too quickly. So, on the one hand, historically, people have talked about things being brought in too quickly, and now today I've heard criticism around the chamber that the government's taking too long. And actually, I think the government is right to take the appropriate time to get this right, and I fully back the Cabinet Secretary in doing that. There's also been discussion around the chamber around the importance of culture change and whether creating Qualification Scotland will have the effect. And there has been discussion around Schedule 3, which transfers people, quite rightly, under employment law to the new body. I would say this as somebody who was involved in the Social Security Act 2018 and had responsibility as Minister for Social Security, responsible for Social Security Scotland. There was a lot of criticism during that period about whether Social Security Scotland would be able to embrace a new culture. And there were some people who wanted to exclude previous employees of DWP from working for Social Security Scotland. And rightly, those calls were rejected for a whole range of reasons. And I can tell you that today there are many people who used to work for DWP doing an excellent job for Social Security Scotland and delivering a very different service, particularly with regard to child disability payment and adult disability payment, with a very different culture in that organisation. Yeah, sure.
Stephen Kerr.
But the point, Ben McPherson, is not about the employees. It's about leadership. It's highly feasible. Got lots of really good people working in these organisations. In fact, many of them have given anonymous evidence to the committee, as I can read the report, as he can. It's not about that. It's about leadership, isn't it? Getting the change of leadership we need.
Ben McPherson.
Well, I'm not going to speak about individual people at the top of organisations or groups of people. But the reason I wanted to make the point I did was to draw out clarification in that regard. I also appreciate the points in the committee's report about leadership and those that have been made in the chamber today. But also we want to utilise the expertise and experience in Scotland that's appropriate in this regard, and I'm sure the right balance will be found. And I trust my colleagues on the committee to be able to probe that through the various stages to come. The third point I want to make out of four is around the fact that this bill will, if passed, will be the first step in the education reform journey and the vision of delivering what Professor Muir put forward, the OECD's proposals, and taking forward Hayward, as the Cabinet Secretary set out in a recent statement. I think that as well as this being the first step, it's important to remember that we're building the foundations here for a system that will need to be agile, probably more than any education system beforehand in Scotland in the 21st century. And I do sometimes worry that collectively, when it comes to education, we think in a 20th century mindset, when really we need to be in a Hayward plus 21st century, perhaps 22nd century mindset, because of the rapid change that we're going to see in the global economy due to technology in the period ahead. So some food for thought. And lastly, a point that we discussed briefly at Education Committee when I was on it, is that while I appreciate points around the perception of SQA domestically, we should note that SQA has a very, very trusted and respected brand abroad in some of the revenue raising that is done by the organisation, and we will want to see that preserved, both for the reputation of Scotland in terms of education internationally and also because of the revenue that it will bring in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr McPherson. We now move to the closing speeches. I call first Ross Greer, up to 6 minutes. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll pick up where I finished my opening speech on the need for good culture and practice, particularly in how Qualification Scotland will engage with young people, because that's not the experience young people have had with the SQA, even those young people who've been involved nationally in its own structures. We've heard previously from the members of the Scottish Youth Parliament who sat on the National Qualifications Group and SERG, the Education Recovery Group from the pandemic, who talked about, for example, receiving papers for meetings that were hundreds of pages long the night before or even the morning of a meeting. Now, that's not accessible for adult professionals, never mind young volunteers that we expect to be able to contribute. Those who've been involved in the SQA's Learner Panel have regularly talked about the feedback it's given just simply being ignored and never making it beyond SQA senior management. So one of the amendments that I'm intending on bringing forward is to make the new Learner Advisory Committee and the Teacher and Lecturer Advisory Committee directly accountable to the board, not to the senior management of Qualifications Scotland. And on the board, given there's been a number of contributions on that, I've been critical for years of the balance of the SQA's current board. I think it's wrong that the current SQA board has for years had more management consultants than teachers. Now, there's a space for management consultants. Good corporate governance is important, but that's not the right balance on our national exams body. I think the bill does start to rebalance it, but my preference would be to go a bit further. And John Mason, I think, made a very important point around the current wording around a space on the board for those with knowledge of those undertaking qualifications. Now, that to me reads as an adult who will speak on behalf of young people rather than a young person. So I think we do need to balance the fact. I think there is space on the board for an adult who's, for example, an expert in the rights of children and young people. That's not the same as having a young person there. And it is also important to consider, when we talk about learners, the distinction between children and young people and adult learners. But as John Mason says, children and young people, school-age students, are of such importance here. I think there does need to be space for them specifically. Now, my preference to the board is something more similar to the GTCS model. I think a majority of board members should be registered teachers or lecturers. Within that, there should be spaces for those who are current classroom teachers. There's a value in having retired teachers, head teachers, members of senior management involved with their contributions, but there's particular importance in having current classroom teachers involved in the governance here. And I think we do need to strengthen up the provision for someone who represents the interests of staff to make sure that that individual is actually chosen, elected by staff, and the obvious method being through their recognised unions. The two advisory committees, I think, do need further strengthened. The convener mentioned it in his remarks. I would ask the question, why is there a provision for staff of the organisation to be on these committees at all? Parliamentary clerks or advisers to our committees don't sit on the committees, they support them. Council officers don't sit on council committees. So I would suggest that we amend that to simply specify that members of the Advisory Committee to Qualifications Scotland cannot themselves be members of staff at Qualifications Scotland, because even a minority can dominate, especially in a situation where that minority are adult professionals on a body that is set up a space that is designed for children and young people. And that goes to, I think, the really important point that Willie Rennie made around making sure that we hear from the boy at the back of the class who would never otherwise engage, who's never going to be on the Learner Advisory Committee. And that's why I mentioned earlier on the amendment that I'm bringing that would require much wider consultation from the organisation, not just with the relatively self-selecting groups who will be involved at a national level. And I think I can say that as a former MSYP. Yes.
Jackie Dunbar, briefly.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. How can we actually get the children that are not engaged to engage with us? I know that's a very difficult question, and I'm doing it through the chair. Thank you very much, President.
Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would love to have another 6 minutes to talk about that. As a former MSYP, the one specific that I've mentioned is going back to my opening contribution. As it stands, the SQA has no ability to simply send a direct email to every young person undertaking an SQA qualification. I think as a basic operational issue, there should be the ability for Qualifications Scotland to do that, so that it can pose these kind of simple questions, that it can send out basic surveys and get a much wider response. Further effort will be required for those most disengaged, but we can't even, as it stands, email every young person who just took the higher history exam to tell them what's going on. I think that's an operational issue that needs resolved. Turning to the Inspectorate, I think the Advisory Council there also needs strengthened. So, for example, there is a space, much as I've mentioned it needs amending, there is a space on the Qualifications Scotland Board for someone representing the interests of their staff. I think the Advisory Council of the Inspectorate needs something similar. The staff of the Inspectorate are those with a huge depth of knowledge, and that should be represented on the Advisory Board. Will Rennie posed an interesting question about why should ministers have the power to direct? I actually think they should, and I think the examples there are things like the policy decision to make sure that our schools are LGBTQ inclusive. I think ministers should be able to direct the Inspectorate to do a thematic inspection to ensure that policy decision has been delivered. Or when it comes to violence against women and girls, to a thematic inspection to see how our schools are actually dealing with that endemic problem. And there's a way to balance that with independence and the balance between government and Parliament as well. So we could require the Chief Inspector to consult with Parliament before planning inspections, for example. I'm aware of time, Presiding Officer. So just in closing, I want to say that this is a good bill. It could be much better, but it is a good bill, and it's one that the Greens will be more than content to support. And I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for her engagement and her openness to proposals to change it at stage 2. There are so many positives for this. I look forward to making those improvements, but this is a huge opportunity that we simply cannot afford to miss. We must support this bill.
Thank you very much. I now call Martin Whitfield again, up to 6 minutes. Mr Whitfield.
Well, Deputy Presiding Officer, it has been a fascinating discussion at this, the stage 1 part of a bill, where it is for this chamber to decide on the advice of the committee whether or not we support the principles of it. And I would like to start by picking up, in fact, on the previous speech from Oscar, plus his opening, plus Willie Rennie's, about the SQA itself and to the response. But before I do that, I want to give the opportunity for a member, if they wish, to intervene on their confidence that the response from the Scottish Government to the committee's reports, whether or not what we've heard from the Cabinet Secretary today has given them confidence that the Scottish Government are in a position to change as far as they wish, or as far as is probably needed from a number of the submissions today. And I'm happy to take an intervention from Douglas Ross.
Douglas Ross.
I'm grateful to Martin Whitfield for posing the question that way, and I think the answer, for me personally, is probably not. But all we're being asked to do today is to agree the general principles of the bill at stage 1. And I and other members may disagree significantly with amendments brought forward by the Scottish Government at stage 2, but we're not at that stage yet, and those amendments will come through the Cabinet Secretary's letter and subsequent amendments at that point.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for the member's intervention and the ability to clarify an earlier position. And I think the difference that certainly I, this side, and Scottish Labour find themselves is with regard to the principles. We actually need to look at the bill that's presented to us, and indeed, possibly more importantly, the policy memorandum, and the fact that the Scottish Government have articulated the principles, and I'll just pick one, that the bill will lay the legal foundation that enables the body, the follower from the SQA, to deliver 2 distinct separate functions to achieve the overarching objectives of develop and award qualifications and to accredit qualifications. So the principle that underpins this bill is a single organisation. And I am greatly concerned about that. I think there are significant numbers of members across this chamber that are particularly concerned at that. And I think, to pick up on Alex Rowley's very, very positive contribution, we are not going to vote against this. But we are not going to vote against the principles. We are going to abstain in, well, I hear humour ringing out across the chamber. Where in the principles is the Scottish Government's confirmation that they will separate those functions? It doesn't exist in the published bill. It doesn't exist in the published papers. It exists in a contribution that's been made today, which within itself shows a challenge the Scottish Government have about being able to articulate what their legislation means from stage 1 to stage 2, and indeed, in some cases, to stage 3. So the option and the opportunity to abstain is an indication from this side of the chamber that substantial changes will need to be made, with the exception of Willie Rennie, but it's an indication that substantial change is needed. And in the short time I have, let me address something that John Mason raised, and I'm glad that he did, which is about the use of the word learner and the significance of not articulating children and young people, who are a significant group that fall into this. And I think the proposal that John Mason made about adding to the description of learner with children, young people and learners to take into account adult learners is one that the Scottish Government needs to seriously look at. Bill Kidd mentioned this as well in his very thoughtful contribution. And the reason that children need to appear in this is because of the UNCR, and it is because of human rights. Learners are not right holders under human rights. Children and young people are rights holders, and without their specific identification within the legislation, they could seriously be challenged should they wish to say that the subsequent legislation has failed them and that their specific human rights have been breached. We are specific duty bearers in respect of this, and that's why raising it is so important. It also pays attention to the significant number of contributions that relate to the lack of consultation, the lack of a role for children and young people in participating in decisions that will very specifically affect them. And we've heard, again from Russ Greer, the very obvious one: the SQA can't even write to children. But more importantly, children can't write to the SQA and expect an answer. And indeed, the Commissioner has pointed out that the distance between the SQA and young people is a recurring theme that's raised by them. They feel like there is no way they can feed back to the SQA. And they are keen to do it. They want to say what their experiences are, and some of those experiences are not great. On a number of occasions, we have had legislation that has come to this chamber post the UNCRC, which has lacked the language of the UNCRC, has lacked in explicit terms all that was talked about why bringing that bill, bringing that legislation, fighting to get that legislation onto the statute book is so important. And again, we have an example. It is talked about. We nod towards it. But when you ask, where can you point in black and white in this proposed bill? Where can you point in black and white in the supporting documents? There is a lack of support for children and young people. Under the circumstances, the Chamber are aware of Scottish Labour's intention tonight. And I thank Deputy Presiding Officer for your patience.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Whitfield. I now call Ros McCall up to 7 minutes. Ms McCall.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be closing the debate today on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. And I would like to add my thanks for all the work done by clerks and staff and everyone who took part to bring forward this Stage 1 bill, to that of the others who have already mentioned that in the Chamber today. It's already been mentioned that we on these benches are supportive of the bill in principle. We've been calling for education reform for years, and we're very vocal on the need to move forward with proposals in the review by Professor Muir. I'm glad to see the bill coming forward, but it has to be said it falls short. There is so much more to do to realise the outcomes of the review. I cannot put it better than the Association of Directors of Education Scotland when they stated, "There is a danger that change will be minimal and that the existing elements of the system are being repackaged and reinstated in a different order. This does not meet with what the required or recommended by Muir, Hayward or the OCD." NASUWT stated that it notes the decisions taken within the bill to ignore Professor Muir's recommendations that Qualifications Scotland should include the awarding functions of SQA but not the accreditation functions in this area, and would reiterate that it is their belief that this is unwise. The Education Scotland Bill is a piece of legislation that claims to address the deep-rooted issues plaguing our education system, but it's not there yet. And as the Education Committee Stage 1 report has shown, this bill falls significantly short of the transformative change our young people, teachers and educational institutions desperately need. But we, on these benches, will work constructively with the Government in the run-up with amendments to Stage 2. I want to mention a couple of contributions, as I always do, and I want to add my comments to the voice of Willie Rennie, Bill Kidd, John Mason, Martin Whitfield and Ross Greer, when they meant that it is essential that we have the voice of the child, and I want to add to that. It has been well mentioned today that there is cross-party support for reform and for the direction of change, and I welcome the comments by the Cabinet Secretary in her opening remarks on the impetus for reform. And it's equally backed across this chamber by Miles Briggs, Ross Greer, Willie Rennie and Bill Kidd, to name but a few. I think it's important also to reiterate the many comments that have been made that His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education is not only independent but must be seen to be independent, because perception is paramount. And that was mentioned by Miles Briggs, Willie Rennie, Jackie Mumbar and eloquently put across by Sue Webber. And one final point that I think needs to be mentioned, that we've heard of the issues of trust, not only when it comes to the SQA, but also with Education Scotland. Ross Greer has been commenting that the SQA has issues since 2017. Sue Webber said the word tarnished, which I think is a very good word. And Stephen Kerr powerfully articulated Professor Priestley. And I do agree that he has hit the bullseye with his comments that the system is set up to justify itself and to celebrate its successes rather than take a critical look at what is happening. And equally, on a personal note, I'm going to echo Miles Briggs and Evelyn Tweed, because as a member of the cross-party group on deafness, I note the recommendations of the committee that the bill is amended to place specific requirements on Qualifications Scotland and His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education to take account the needs and interests of those who use BSL or wish to do so. For far too long we have let down the deaf community. Too many students are left isolated without adequate teaching, and this must stop. Deputy Presiding Officer, Scotland's education system once stood as a beacon of excellence. Yet under this government we've seen a steady decline. International rankings tell us a troubling story. Scotland's PISA scores in maths and science are at record lows. The attainment gap remains almost stagnant, with outcomes for the poorest pupils remaining virtually unchanged. Teachers experience violence in the classroom on a daily basis. ASN pupils are not currently adequately supported. Deaf students are being failed, with a continual reduction in the number of BSL teachers, and care-experienced pupils are still routinely excluded from school. Scotland's children should not be subjected to this, and our education system needs a government that will stand up and make the changes necessary. And this bill has the opportunity to be part of this change. At the heart of this bill is proposed replacement of the Scottish Qualifications Authority with Qualifications Scotland. But the committee report has made it clear that this risks being more than just a rebranding exercise with a minimal structural change or cultural reform. Stakeholders, from teachers to school leavers, have rightly criticised the lack of ambition, and therefore it's imperative that a new body must not inherit the same lack of transparency, trust and accountability that has tarnished the SQA. I'm going to conclude now, Presiding Officer. I'm sure glad to hear so. And it's clear that this bill must be substantially improved if it's to deliver for Scotland's learners, teachers and families. The committee's report, alongside concerns from education stakeholders, has laid bare the significant shortcomings of the current proposals. Scotland's educational challenges are too great to ignore. Scotland's children and young people deserve a bold, visionary approach to education reform. This bill, as it stands, doesn't meet that standard. An amendment at the next stages will be needed to ensure the vision is realised, and as I've already said, we will assist with that. We owe it to the next generation to demand better. We must deliver a system that works for all learners, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And while we agree with the bill's broad principles, substantial changes are required at stage 2. So let this be the moment that we in this place commit to bold reform needed to restore Scotland's world-class education system. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McCall. I now call on Jenny Gilruth to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary, up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am grateful to members across the Chamber who have contributed to the debate on the bill this afternoon, both in committee and also here in the Chamber today. I'd also like to reiterate my thanks to all the stakeholders who have engaged in the process of reform at every stage. And I want to put on record my thanks to the bright sparks in my team, the hard-working civil service, who support governments of all parties and who can be found today at the back of the chamber. I'm sure Mr Kerr will greet them as he leaves today. I also want to put on record my wishes to the Chamber for a happy Christmas, but in particular to Scotland's parents, carers, teachers and our young people. Christmas is just around the corner. I know it's the end of the winter term, and so I wish them all a very happy break when it comes. Presiding Officer, one of the key points from this debate bears repeating. The bill is a single but a significant component of our ongoing programme in relation to education reform. I've set out a range of other actions we are taking today in that regard, but it does provide the scaffolding around which other non-legislative changes are being built and already being taken forward. Now, I want to come to a number of points that members have raised this afternoon. I hope I managed to come to most of them. There were some key themes that emerged in the debate this afternoon. The first I thought that was most telling was in relation to trust, and I think that trust was mentioned by nearly every MSP this afternoon in relation to the creation of this new qualifications body. Rebuilding that trust between Scotland's teachers and the qualifications body is not going to be without challenge, but it is inherently important that we get that trust right. And we also have to work with Scotland's young people. And there's been reflections in the Chamber around some of the challenges that were experienced there during the pandemic. And I recognise that challenge and that lack of trust still exists in the system. So what we create next matters. We need to rebuild between Scotland's teachers, between our young people and the new qualifications body itself. Now, Jackie Dunbar spoke about confidence in the new qualifications body, which I think speaks to that requirement for trust. And Sue Webber rightly pointed to the need for cultural change, which will be essential to driving the improvements that we all want to see. Douglas Ross made a number of very important points, many of which I agreed with, which took me by surprise somewhat, but nonetheless, I think in the space we are currently working in, it's very helpful. And certainly in his role as education convener, there are a number of areas in which I would agree with him. He spoke about the Learner Interest Committee and the Strategic Advisory Board. I think it's important to say that the Learner Interest Committee is a new mechanism to inform Qualifications Scotland's decision-making, so that is new. SQA doesn't currently have that function, but I'm happy to hear, and I think I've made this point on a number of occasions in the debate this afternoon, Presiding Officer, if members want to come forward with amendments, I will listen to them, I will meet with them. I have already spent some time with Mr Rennie, Mr Greer, and meeting with Mr Briggs. I haven't heard yet from Ms Duncan Glancy. I know she's desperate to talk to me, and I'm sure the Scottish Labour Party will be able to bring themselves to support the bill at stage 2, because that's what we all want to see fundamentally, education reform delivered for the benefit of our children and young people. Now, Mr Ross touched on a number of other areas, and I'm very cognizant of time, Presiding Officer. I'm not going to be able to touch on all of them today, so I will move on to Mr Greer's contributions this afternoon. Now, Mr Greer talked about our time on the Education Committee in the previous Parliament, which I remember well, and I was struck from his contribution, but also from my own reflections of the similarities in our findings last session and to those that the Education Committee are dealing with currently. I do very much recognise the operational problem he talked to in relation to how the qualifications body engages with the teaching profession. I think that's a matter that I would like to take further advice on. I think there are challenges there potentially in relation to how we share data with the qualifications body, but those should not be insurmountable. And actually, when problems arise, and we have had one such problem in very recent history, there should be an opportunity for the qualifications body to communicate directly with the teaching profession. I thought that was a point very well made, so I will take that away from today's debate. Miles Briggs talked about the impetus for change, and he spoke about recent history. He also, I think, mentioned what happened in the year 2000 in relation to the exams qualifications body. At that time, I well remember it. The year before, I think I received my higher results, and the wrong exam results were issued at that point over 20 years ago. So building back trust then, 20 years ago, was hugely important. And similarly, today, that's exactly where the government finds ourselves, in rebuilding that trust. He also raised the issue in relation to BSL, and I think that was raised by Ros McCall in her closing remarks, and I want to again put on the record, and I put this in response to the convener in the committee, that the government will be bringing forward amendments to that end. It's hugely important that that is recognised, and I provided evidence on that too when I spoke to committee earlier this year. He talks about delay, and I don't, Presiding Officer, make any apology for taking a further year to consult with Scotland's teaching profession, who I believe are hugely important to the delivery of what comes next. And happy to do so.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking this intervention. One of the, I think, key areas we have touched upon is what's the future for Education Scotland? Because at the minute we don't really have a vision. So I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary was going to outline that, if not in this bill, then before this Parliament ends.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm happy to do so. I'm conscious of time, so I'm more than happy to write to the member on this, and I should declare an interest as a former employee of Education Scotland some years ago now. He may be aware of the GIQ that was published earlier this year, which set out a refocused purpose for Education Scotland, which looks at curriculum delivery. That is because my view is that the organisation had become involved in lots of other things, and I wanted it very clearly focused on supporting curriculum and supporting teachers in our schools, which, if you go back to the ethos behind the establishment of the organisation, was really what it was meant to be about back in 2011-2012. But I'm more than happy to share further detail with him on that. And I also remind him that in relation to the further work Education Scotland will be taking forward, we will be advertising for a Chief Executive very soon, and that, I think, will be really fundamental to driving some of the cultural change we need to see. Willie Rennie spoke about the strength of the Inspectorate, and I have sympathy from my own experiences of the need for the Inspectorate evidence base to be flagging concerns and providing evidence and advice and challenge to ministers in government. His party's views, of course, on the independence of the Chief Inspector are pretty consistent. I well recall Tavish Scott having these debates in the previous Parliament, and I'm sure Mr Scott will be delighted to know the government now supports his views in that regard. And in terms of further engagement with Mr Rennie on this point, I'm more than happy to listen to his views on this. I think it is imperative to say that it would be extremely rare for the Cabinet Secretary to instruct an inspection. Indeed, in my experience, it has only happened on one occasion. It's very, very rare. And I heard some contrary views to that end from Mr Greer in relation to thematic inspections. And of course, we've had a number of thematic inspections recently on maths and numeracy. We have one that will be publishing in the early new year on local authorities and their improvement functions, and I'm sure the Parliament will be keen to know the results of that. And I do remind Parliament that when Graham Donaldson was Chief Inspector, it was always HMI an executive agency, so it was always answerable to ministers. So I'm not necessarily sure I would accept that critique per se. I am conscious of time, Presiding Officer, but it would be remiss of me not to touch on the position that the Scottish Labour Party finds itself in this evening. And I am glad that Pam Duncan-Glancy agrees the SQA needs to be abolished and the need for the creation of the post of Chief Inspector. But to vote for the general principles at committee and then today adopt a completely different position is totally incoherent. I have had engagement with the Liberal Democrats, with the Green Party, with the Conservatives that's already in the diary, but nothing from the Scottish Labour Party. So I hope that Labour will now be able to reach out to me and engage with me on these amendments that they want to see brought forward, because I know they support the principles behind education reform, even if today they strangely cannot find themselves able to back the general principles of the bill, despite the fact that was the position that Ms Duncan-Glancy found herself in a matter of weeks ago. Presiding Officer, I am conscious of time, and Scotland's teachers are watching today. They expect this Parliament to deliver a replacement for the SQA, and in a Parliament of minorities it will take a collective effort to ensure this bill does exactly that. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on Education Scotland Bill at stage 1. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion. I call Paul Sweeney for a point of order.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wish to raise a point of order with you in relation to a matter raised in health questions this afternoon. I asked the Minister about the cut to the mental health budget in the 25-26 financial year. The Minister said that the premise of my question was incorrect and suggested that the mental health budget had in fact increased. Presiding Officer, as per the Scottish Parliament's Information Centre published information on the budget, in real terms, £267.2 million was allocated to the mental health budget in 24-25. In the 25-26 draft budget, £264.2 million was allocated to this budget line. That is quite an obvious arithmetical real terms cut of 1.1%. That is published in front of this Parliament in Spice. So I could ask your advice, Presiding Officer, on a matter of accuracy and reporting of financial information to this Parliament, particularly by ministers. Would you be able to perhaps offer some guidance, written or otherwise, on how ministers should present financial information to Parliament and parliamentarians?
I think it's fair to say, Mr Sweeney, that some of those matters raised are not matters for the Chair, and I would repeat, as I have many times, that the content of members' contributions is ordinarily a matter for the member. The member can raise it directly with the member with whom he has a concern, and I know that the Chamber will be aware at this point in the session of that the Parliament has a corrections mechanism and how that mechanism operates. Thank you. The next item of business is consideration of motion 15897 in the name of Shona Robertson on a financial resolution for the Education Scotland Bill, and I call on Jenny Gilruth to move the motion. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 15918 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme, and I call on the Minister to move the motion.
President Officer, in moving the motion, I would draw members' attention to the debate that we're now scheduling on the 9th of January, a Scottish Government debate on building a migration system which supports Scotland's economy, public services and communities. Last week I undertook to reschedule the Stage 1 debate on Jeremy Balfour's Disability Commissioner Bill, so that achieves that. And with that, I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 15918 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. And the next item of business is consideration of business motions 15919 on a Stage 1 timetable for a bill and 15920 on a Stage 2 timetable for a bill. And I ask any member who wishes to speak to the motions to press their request to speak button. And I call on the Minister on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau to move the motions.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak to the motions. Therefore, the question is that motions 15919 and 15920 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motions are therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I ask Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau to move motions 15921 on approval of an SSI and 15922 on designation of a lead committee.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question on these motions will be put at decision time, and there are three questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first is that motion 15876 in the name of Jenny Gilruth on Education Scotland Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote, and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.